Hi everybody!
I've been highly critical of cinematic games in the past. Look no further than my video discussing why cinematic games are boring. That's not to say I'm entirely against the concept of cinematic video games. Far from it. I just feel like the vast majority of them suffer from the same issue. Namely, they're far too focused on the cinematic side and not enough on the gameplay aspects. But I would say from what we've seen thus far, 007 First Light is cinematic gaming done right. So, what is cinematic gaming done right? I would say it's when the cinematic elements are utilized to highlight the exceptionally cool moments found within the moment-to-moment gameplay. This is something the Uncharted games got right, and they did so when cinematic gaming was literally in its infancy. Have they aged as gracefully as they otherwise could have? Certainly not. By modern standards, the first game is exceptionally bare bones and adherently sticks to the design philosophies which were popular in the mid-2000s. As gaming environments have gotten deeper and more complex, the needs have changed. It's no longer acceptable to just have the world as set dressing. Gamers now demand the world be highly interactive, which comes with its own set of problems. Since the advent of HD gaming, everything has been shown in greater detail, and when an asset hasn't been modeled to withstand that level of scrutiny, it really shows. During the early days of 3D gaming, modelers could hide low-poly set dressing more easily. This is partially what allowed dev times to be so short. However, when you have highly crafted environments like those found in Insomniac's Spider-Man games, or yes, even 007 First Light, that's where you start to see why games now take at least 3 to 5 years to develop, which is one of my major issues with cinematic games, the length of time they take to craft. But as the recent First Light State of Play highlighted, the wait can be worth it when the game is of a high caliber. But there are other things that make a great cinematic game beyond set dressing and general presentation. There needs to be substance to back it up. Think of games like Ratchet & Clank or Kena Bridge of Spirits. At their core, they're rather simplistic games that take inspiration from classic platformers, Saturday morning cartoons, and even cinema from the likes of DreamWorks or Pixar. If you look at Kena, the game really would not work in this day and age were it not for the cinematic presentation used to accentuate the grandiose scale of both the platforming and the combat. Because at the core, the game is merely a bare-bones platformer with some bare-bones hack-and-slash elements, combined with some ideas borrowed from the Pikmin series. I know this probably sounds like a tangent, but it's building to why 007 First Light is doing cinematic game in the correct way. Basically, it actually feels like the next logical evolution of the formula established in the Hitman games. In the Hitman games, you're effectively put into a sandbox built around stealth and infiltration, both of which are highly popular game genres and have been as long as I've been a gamer. They aren't my favorite type of game, but when a stealth game is done to perfection, it just feels really special. And sure, there was a cinematic quality to Hitman 3, the most recent Hitman release, but it wasn't the main focus of the game, and truthfully, any action gameplay was more the result of you having fucked things up royally, meaning the stuff you would typically find in a third-person shooter didn't feel nearly as polished as it otherwise could have been, which seems like it's going to be one of the strengths for First Light when that launches in late March of next year. The action combat is blending seamlessly into the stealth sandbox environment, which IO Interactive have painstakingly crafted for the player. We're going to circle back around to what makes 007 First Light a pillar of cinematic gaming in a moment, but first we need to highlight what makes a bad cinematic gaming experience. Basically, a bad cinematic game can be likened to a game where player agency is not taken into consideration and you're more railroaded down an intended experience, and you're more passively engaging with it between cutscenes. This would be something akin to The Last of Us, which is basically a glorified walking simulator with some shooty elements thrown in. The story's not even all that good. As I covered previously, a lot of my issues with the cinematic gaming experience comes down to the cookie-cutter approach of being third-person over-the-shoulder action games. Generally speaking, this is an issue with a lot of modern output from PlayStation, since they were the pioneers of this style of game. I personally found the latest God of War games to be especially bad for this, as they didn't feel nearly as fun as the older entries, which had twitchier and more exciting moment-to-moment gameplay. But there's also the quick-time event slogfests. Look, I'll admit I can enjoy these titles from time to time, since Quantic Dream have managed to make me invested in the characters and storylines, but I wouldn't exactly call them the pinnacle of game design. Merely, they use the quick-time events to make the player feel in some semblance of control, as messing these up can lead to dire consequences. They're kind of like the video game equivalent of a choose-your-own-adventure novel, a good idea and concept, but ultimately feel rather generic at the end of the day. But it can sometimes work if the storyline is interesting enough. I just find there's precious few examples for this style of game done well, as I'm not particularly a fan of any other example of this type of game beyond Heavy Rain, as I find the storylines of these games tends to be rather pretentious and self-indulgent. So now that I've covered what makes good and bad cinematic games in rather broad brushstrokes, it's time to take a closer look at what makes First Light a legitimately good example of a cinematic gaming experience. For one, the game doesn't linger too long on any one facet of the experience. For a lot of cinematic games, they end up being more geared towards the cutscenes than the actual gameplay, almost to the point they should have been movies in the first place. Then again, if they were movies or TV shows, they'd be panned by audience and critics alike for just not being that good. Truthfully, the average gamer is far more forgiving of storytelling than audiences of other mediums. I think this is down to the fact video games never really were considered cinematic experiences until we started seeing titles pay homage to cinema in the early 2000s through to present times. But First Light seemingly not being all that interested in dwelling on the cutscenes and putting the player back in the driver's seat is an example of how to use the cinematic elements to enhance the experience. Think about it. A lot of times when you're playing a game and hit a very long cutscene, chances are you're going to tune out pretty quickly. Some will blame this on internet culture sapping our attention spans, and maybe there's a kernel of truth to that. But, generally speaking, it's because the dialogue for the average video game cutscene is not all that interesting. And try as they might, the voice actors really can only do so much with what they're given. Seriously, just like a movie or show is only as good as its script, the same holds true for cinematic video games. For example, if the gameplay of something is really good, then it's super easy to overlook a bland or boring storyline. Look no further than things like Shin Megami Tensei or any Souls-like game. For those experiences, the storytelling is very much secondary and is more there to set up the gameplay. This is a tactic that has been used in gaming basically ever since it was created. It's also partially why 007 First Light is going to work out incredibly well as a cinematic video game. Seriously, James Bond movies as a whole have never really been intended as anything more than really fun to look at eye candy. The storylines are also generally not all that deep. If you're looking at the Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and George Lazenby eras of the films, they were pretty much find out what the bad guys, usually the Soviets or some larger-than-life character, are up to and stop them, leading to very simplistic storytelling. You started to see more complex storytelling creep in with the Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and Daniel Craig eras of Bond. This was partially because cinema-goers through these eras of films were demanding more complex storytelling. But we really only got truly complex storytelling in the last few Craig outings. This is because the Dalton and Brosnan films were still standalone adventures at the end of the day, where the character of James Bond didn't go through any significant development at the end of the day, leading to a stagnant or flat character arc, which is totally fine. We know we won't have a flat character arc for IO Interactive's version of Bond though, as this franchise of games is intended to be a trilogy. So there will be some character progression during and between games, but I'm trying to highlight the fact First Light has very simple storytelling at the end of the day. During the trailers we've had so far, we know Bond gets recruited to the MI6 program, and the story is about earning the title of 007. We also know he'll be up against 009, who's a fellow agent that seems to have gone rogue. Couple that with the tropes found within the Bond films of exotic locations and exotic cars, and you pretty much have the right ingredients for a game. You also have elements borrowed from games like Uncharted, the Hitman series, and a bunch of other highly interactive action games. The cinematic nature of the game is just being used to enhance what's already there, adding some flash to the substance. So are you hyped up for 007 First Light, or is this a game you're going to end up skipping at the end of the day? Let me know in the comments. In my opinion, March 26th can't come soon enough, and I hope to get a review of the game out pretty soon after that. If you want more of my video essays like this, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and check out my video on why cinematic games are boring, as it's kind of a companion piece to this video. And until next time, keep blazing that trail.